Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of introducing our first keynote speaker for Brain EdTech Summit 2026. Can we please put the hands together for Godwin Benson? Can we please put the hands together for him? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that amazing introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to say a very big thank you to Aderunke and her team for putting this amazing event together. I have a special respect for people that can put together events. I have sucked at it for years. So well done. I know the hard work that goes into things like this. So thank you. And I think the conversation today is very important. And I'll be sharing on something that is quite personal to me. Because even amongst our teams, I've had to ask myself, having been in the edtech space now for almost 12 years, what really is the role of education in Africa? And as the world is changing with the likes of AI, where do we stand? What is our role? What role do we play? What advantage does this bring to us? Like someone asked one time, do you use AI? I'm sure most of us do. Next question, are you making more money now because you use AI? Are you richer? Have you saved costs on your operations? If the answer is yes, then you're starting to use it the right way. So my speech today is going to try to challenge us to look at African education in a new light. And the reason for that is education as it is in its very crux is a business of transformation, right? The point of education is that the one who has received it should be able to demonstrate new capabilities that they couldn't do before. Be that social, technical, relational, whatever, right? And so I would like us to take a look at, is Africa really catching up, or do we have an opportunity presented to us now to lead in that conversation? Can we go to the next slide? The first question is, go on, you can skip this intro slides. Yes, how can Africa catch up? You know, the more I thought about this, I realized that it's the wrong question we're asking, because it gives the idea that the systems that exist elsewhere in the more developed world, it's like the final finish line that is working. And so Africa has to try to measure up to the system that exists. But when you examine the results that have come out of that system, you realize that it's not really the finish line. What do we think? Do we think the education systems of the world right now are really, is perfect the way it's meant to be? And then Africa has to try to match up to that system. What do you think? Yes or no? Okay, cool. Let's go to the next slide. I make the case here that it's not really the finish line, right? The educational systems as we know it is breaking. You see where most times the people who you've hired in your companies, you've not paid so much attention on their certificates or even which school they attended. You have paid more attention on what they can actually do, their capabilities, right? We see that the system that exists today have led to teacher shortages. In fact, Africa is said to need 15 million teachers to match up with the demand of learners. The question is, where would you get 15 million quality teachers? So this begins to hint that Africa needs to lead a different trail. And I'm saying this because in the room we have educators, we have education influencers, institutional leaders. We need to start rethinking about what is our role to make education effective for the continent. Next slide, please. And so I begin by asking a very important question. What can Africa build for its own reality that the rest of the world would eventually need? Because that's what you mean when you say you're not catching up. You're what? You're catching on. It means that you build relevance. You solve a problem so well that the world has to come learn from the solutions that you've come up with. Now, next slide. To examine what that looks like, go on. I think the first thing to do is to take a closer look at the reality of Africa. And this is instructive because when you think about the history of education, the classroom experience you have, one teacher, a group of people, it started because there were specific needs post-World War where you had to train people for specific skill sets. So you needed people who could work the factories. You had chemical engineers. You needed people who could do specific things. And so that system was built for that problem at the time. But now, what is the problem that Africa has today? And I put it to you that the biggest problem we have is that we have the largest young population in the world. It's going to become even larger. And we have that almost all of the increase in the working age population globally in the next 25 years will happen inside of Africa. And then if you stretch that further, around half of that number, 1.6 billion people, will be under the age of 25. And then the median age there is between 17 to 19. So in context, Africa would have around 850 million people who their most important need would be jobs, will be education, will be skills that they can convert into economic value. It could be the biggest advantage that we have, or it could be the biggest disaster that we face as a continent. So when I think about what is the role of education in Africa, it has to go beyond just delivering learning, right? It has to be able to solve the problem we've been dealt with, right? We've been dealt this problem of increasing population, youths not being engaged. How does education solve that problem? Now, it's easy to say that that's a government thing, but if you look at history, the most successful businesses have done things that government didn't do, wouldn't do, or couldn't do, right? Look at healthcare, finance, even prison. Things that the government would probably not do, that's the opportunity to solve it. And I think this calls for leaders to just take a different approach to how we go about creating solutions in education. Next slide, please. The same thing, the rest of the world is, growing older, but Africa has the workforce. So Africa would be the workforce of the world. Yeah, where you see the world will have capital, but Africa will have people. Young people with energies, with skills, hopefully. And that is how you solve the problem of poverty, taking people out of poverty by giving them skills so that when the capital comes in, it flows towards them. Right? Next slide, please. So this also means, by extension, the talent supply for the world will come from Africa, right? The market demand, what's more interesting is the problems of education globally would eventually become Africa's problem because we have the highest stake. We have the largest number of people that need to be educated. And so that is the premise upon which we can lead the conversation, because we will feel the brunt the most, more than any other region on earth. Next slide. But before we can shape global education, the first thing is we have to solve our own problem. So my argument this morning is Africa has an opportunity to teach the world how to rapidly educate people at scale and get them into productive work, right? That's the opportunity we have. It's a challenge, but solving that challenge means we can create an archetype for how can you mass train, for instance, 10 million people, whatever the skill is, whether it's technical, academic, whatever. How can you do that at scale and get them into productive work? That is the task that Africa has to prove over the next decade. So, next slide. These are some of the gaps that we know. Most people on the continent before the age of 10 can't really read, right? And sometimes you don't know this until you leave Lagos. I remember during my NYSC days in Ibadan, the English language teacher taught English in Yoruba, right? And that's very fascinating. So how are those kids supposed to learn how to speak English, right? And they had a Yoruba class separately. But, we'll come to that. It's always going to be underfunded. So the systems of education that requires for people to pay so much can't really work in Africa, right? It will not work because it's underfunded. And you will never have enough teachers for the number of students that need to be taught. So how do you build around these constraints? Next slide, please. Of course, you can also assume that there is internet connectivity. So the likes of Udemy, Coursera, and the rest, they don't really work at scale here. Because most people don't have internet connectivity. If we even slice this further, they don't even have devices. It's shared amongst a family of 2 or 3. So how do you build with all these constraints? This is the opportunity Africa has to show the world a different education paradigm. Next slide. Some things here that are assumed in the Western education is, you have one qualified teacher per classroom. When I was in school, we didn't have a maths teacher, we didn't have further maths teacher. There were a lot of, we didn't have, I think, those two. So for many people, it's not true that there will be a teacher in every class. I can see someone smiling. You didn't have a teacher in your school too. Right. Okay, cool. Now, there's, permanent school building. Well, I went to a pretty small school. When it rained, the rain got into our class because it came from the right, from the left, and from the roof, right? So we didn't have building. We didn't have stuff to learn. There was no reliable electricity, right? And the last point is very instructive. There was no job waiting at the end, right? There was no job. So how would you build for this reality? Is what every entrepreneur has to be thinking. Everyone who is interested in education. How do you build for this world, right? Next slide. So these are not obstacles to a known model. They're actually the specifications for how to build a new model. Next slide, please. So I just asked a few questions here. How do we teach well where there will never be enough teachers? And I don't have the answers, right? I'm challenging us to think about models. Now, AI gives us the opportunity to do a lot of things, but as has been tested in other climes, AI alone is not really the solution. Why? And I'll tell you. Because most people are not capable of self-directed learning. Most people are not. That's why you have teachers come sit down, learn, whether it's online or offline. You have somebody creating that accountability structure, guiding you and ensuring that you're following a defined pathway to the end goal. So, but how do you teach when there will never be enough teachers, right? How do you reach learners whose connectivity, power and language you can't really assume? You don't know if they would have power, right? How do you prove capability when certificate no longer proves competence, right? And lastly, how do you make learning pay for itself in a market where families cannot pre-fund? Where I'm trying to prime our minds to something that happened with our music industry. Many years ago, most of our artists were trying to sound like the Americans in the music. You know those songs, right? They were trying to sound like them, But there was a point where we decided to say, no, this is not us. We are Africans, and our music is different. And from the point where we accepted that fact, you saw the likes of Afro this, Afro that, and guess where we are now? The world has to pay attention to the music coming out of Africa. The same thing has to happen in education. And in fact, I will stretch it, same thing has to happen in our democracy. Because it's not working. What was handed down to us is not for us. We need to redefine what does that mean for Africa, for Nigeria. What does democracy mean? Should we even have democracy? Do we have our own system of government? What works, right? And so I think the same thing has to happen for education. We're not going to try to be like them because being like them has not really worked. Many of us are overeducated and underemployed and do not have the skills to translate that knowledge into profitable enterprise. So that system is wrong. And someone did mention it, where exams are, they're not that useful, to be honest, because it's not a true test of who knows what the most. If I crammed a lot last night, I'm going to get A on a course that I don't know nothing about. So there's a different way we have to think about what must education really be to help somebody that is poor, which is the situation of majority of us in Africa, to actually start to make transition into becoming someone that has value in the economy. So let's go to the next slide. So I make a hypothesis here that, and this is something I challenge myself and my team more now that I think about it. The true purpose of education in Africa is mobility. It means how do we move people from one point of capacity or competence to another. Let's go to the next slide where I try to define it. And this is, I think, what every educational platform or tech or institution has to be deliberate about. Because education makes no sense if the person who learnt it remains where they were before they learnt it, right? For instance, a lot of people who offer skills, we tend to stop at the point of certification. But the people who got the skills, where are they in their lives today? You know, in fact, this is why some of the, the revenue models broke down years ago. This ISA, income share agreement, where, you know, people don't pay up front, they pay at the end. You know, they had learned a software engineering skill and ended up being plumbers. So how do you collect back the money you spent when the person didn't use the tech skill at the end? You know, it doesn't make sense. So the true purpose of education is not to give people schooling. So the concept of school, like I said, was an organized effort to condition people for a specific purpose. And that was necessary then. So education doesn't only happen inside a school, right? Do we agree on that? So now it's never about content. Now in the era of AI, content is ubiquitous. Nobody has exclusive control over content. It's everywhere. You can create it in a snap. And it's not about certificates, even though that's good, but it's never about that, because most of us have plenty. And it's really about how much movement have this person made. And it could be someone who couldn't read and now can read. Simple example, how many of us use Duolingo or have used it for some time? Now, can you hold a full-on conversation for 1 hour in the language you were learning? Let me see your hand. No. Literally nobody. Do you see what I mean? That the systems that have been handed to us don't really deliver true transformation. They are good on the books. They get you the numbers, users, and all of that. Streaks, right? Streaks doesn't mean you can speak French. You have streak, consistent streak, but speak French, you struggle. So I'm challenging us today, and I'm not coming with the answer. I just want to nudge us, our conscience, that Africa doesn't need a Duolingo. We need our own form that truly teaches you how to speak a language. That we can come together and design how to truly learn. Because we don't have time, we don't have resource. You know, if those of us who offer edtech solutions, you know that if somebody pays you, they are literally only your shirt for the outcome. Is that also? Like, once I've paid you that 50K for a class, you must change my life. Because this 50K, I gathered it from several people to pay, right? So education's purpose is what? Mobility. That's my thesis. Next slide, please. And I try to define it that mobility here is a verifiable move from limited opportunity to greater capacity, income, agency, and participation. I'll take that again. Mobility is a verifiable, that's a very important term, something that we can all see and prove or measure, like was said by the previous panelists, that a movement has happened from limited capacity, which is limited opportunity, which is what most of Africa faces, to greater capacity. A child that learns how to read, that's greater capacity, right? A child that learns how to think and solve problems, that's greater capacity. Someone who took your course and got a job afterwards, or better put, you orchestrated his entrance into that job, is more income, right? So when you look at the universe of education, let's not stop our measurement at the metrics within our platform. Users, engagement, number of quizzes done. No, those are good, necessary, but Africa doesn't need that. Africa needs change that we can measure in the real world. And if we want to rank most of the needs Africa has, the most important is income, actually. Yeah, people are nodding their head because it's true. Yeah, income is the number one need of the number one outcome of education. But I think the challenge most times with education or edtech is that the income is so far from the points of engagement. Or like fintech, if I transfer money now, when do you get it? Now. So that instant outcome is what makes us use it. Or Uber, imagine you took a cab and you never got out of the cab, or it took you 2 weeks to get out of that cab, right? So the problem most times is that outcome takes time, right? And I'll show you some ways I've been thinking about that. Next slide, please. So mobility has 5 levels. The first level is access. We need to solve that first. How do you get quality education to people, right? And I think to a large extent, some of that is being solved. Next slide is, how do you get them to engage, right? Streaks and the rest of that. But beyond engagement is capability. How do you ensure that the learner has measurable outcomes? What can they now do that they couldn't do before? The next one is what? Transition, right? That, what has it unlocked for them? What's the next thing? Because, for instance, in the last 40 years, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, multidimensional poverty. How did they do that? By giving them high quality, impactful skills and ensuring that the world would come to China for those skills. Now we made most of them millionaires. Africa needs the same intervention. And so the last is impact. You know, how does it create durable, lasting value in that person's life? Next slide, and I'll just rush now because I'm getting out of time. I think I've talked about this. So Africa needs this, not those, right? It's good to have all those in your app and all of that, but this is what we need. A child starts to read, a student is progressing, his grades are going up. In fact, I learned this the hard way when we had a parent, pay us to get tutors for their kids many years ago. Maybe this was 2017. And the tutor was doing a fantastic job, going to class early, punctual, supporting the child. And then at the end of, I think, a month or so, we asked a feedback from the parent on the process. Just, is the lessons going well? She said, I won't say anything until I see the report card. And then it dawned on me that although we are tracking things within the system, what is important is what? Did the student pass, right? Because no matter how great the tutoring is, if the child doesn't pass, it's not much value, right? So it makes us rethink how we measure outcomes. We have to stretch it one more layer to a verifiable outcome in the real world that moves this individual from one point to another. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I just came up with this, not entirely accurate, but just to give a sense. If you consider the journey most learners go through, and also teachers go through the same journey, right? They discover their need, right? They are taught, that's the learn, whether it's AI, teacher, classroom, tutoring, whatever form. Of course, you assess them, you certify that they know what you've taught them. This is even if you're teaching social skills. If you're teaching whatever, it's the same principle. Then they have to build experience. And that's what Ferdinand was saying, where, the learner has to do the most work for his own learning, right? The teacher cannot do more work than the learner. It means that learning never really happened. The learner has to do the work. And it's in doing the work that they build experience. And so the systems we design, for instance, you've taught a child web design. Don't stop there. Please don't stop there. Teach him how to make money with that web design skill. Let him go out there, offer that service to someone, and turn that to cash. Because our experience, whichever way, like when I first learned how to make shoes, my first shoe, I sold it, I wasn't paid. So I have experience, but it was a bad experience. But at least I had to learn that don't take this on credit, collect your money, sign the papers, right? That was many years ago. So don't stop at you've just given them a skill. They have to get experience in the real world. If you've taught some kids how to speak or read, put together a little competition, get them to practice, get them to build experience. And of course, what Africa really, really needs is this last two. How do you get people pushed closer to income? And I want to also establish that this is the opportunity for us to collaborate more. Because, we have different kinds of edtech. Some are at the earlier stage, maybe K-12. Some are, early years. Some are, higher education. Some are skills. But we need people moving through all these funnels to the point of income. So maybe what we need is more collaboration across all the different providers. If I do K-12 and I do that well, I should be able to funnel those people to the next stage if I don't want to do that, right? If somebody wants a skill in something that I don't offer, I should be able to just push them to someone else. So we have to create this pipeline that moves people from one point to another, right? Next slide, please. So I make a very interesting proposition here that the African education companies that will win in this decade will not really look like EdTech. They're going to become masters at taking people from one point to another, actually orchestrating their entrance from one stage to another stage. just like what is being done with the Learn to Earn program. It's deliberately trying to get people from not knowing anything to becoming financially independent. Because that's the kind of system that Africa needs. Universities, institutions, you can't stop at giving students certification. You have to orchestrate their entrance into the work world. For instance, how many of us were taught how to write a CV in university? Almost nobody. Yeah. So they didn't prepare you even for the barest minimum of getting into work. Africa doesn't need that kind of education. It doesn't help us. It just adds to the number of people who have no work. So in EdTech, you need to think a bit more holistically. How do I take people from one point and get them to the actual outcome that is required? And just rush to the last couple of slides. Yeah, go on. So the main question here is, what do we do? And I just placed with us one question. The real world outcome, what real world outcome does your company exist to produce? And how far beyond the screen are you willing to go to make it happen? Because the real outcome doesn't happen on your product. It happens in the real world. Last two slides, quickly before I step off the stage. Africa's contribution will not be to finally be like the rest of the world. Our role will be to remind the world what education is for, which is expanding human capacity or human possibility. Last slide, please. So Africa is not catching up. We are catching on to the fact that learning is not the destination of education. What's the destination? Mobility. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Can we please appreciate our keynote speaker with a round of applause? A better round of applause. Thank you very much. We have a full room of innovators, educators, and policymakers. And you would agree with me that this keynote speech was truly a very, very beautiful one. Thank you so much.